Okay, welcome everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, and I'm glad you could join us for our Securing Azure AD and Active Directory Summit, brought to you by Ativo Networks, Chaosoft, Emanami, Zoho, and Jump Cloud. Before we start today's three-session event, we do have some announcements. First, we wanted to let you know it's being recorded and will soon be available for future viewing. Also, each session will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, so please be sure to put your questions in for our experts. And during today's third session, we will be giving away an Anycube Mega X 3D printer plus a $200 Amazon gift certificate for supplies. But remember, you must be present to win, so be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have resources from our sponsors available on the console, so please download and check those out. It's because of our sponsors underwriting this content that we can bring you this summit, and we thank them for supporting the community and ask you to check out those resources so we can bring you more events in the future. Now on to the first session, Azure AD and Active Directory, Top Security Issues in 2022. This session features Ian Thornton-Trump, CISO at Cyjax. He is an ITIL certified IT professional with 25 years of experience in IT and security. He has served with the Canadian Forces, Military Intelligence Branch, and the CF Military Police Reserves, retiring as a public affairs officer in 2013. After a year with the RCMP as a criminal intelligence analyst, Ian worked as a cybersecurity analyst/consultant for multinational insurance, banking, and regional healthcare organizations. Ian, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Hey, thanks so much, David. And it's just fantastic to be here with Redmond Channel Partners and our sponsors and everything like that. I just want to talk a little bit first about some of the things that I've been up to. I just had a Security Magazine video podcast go live with Philip Ingram. You'll see Philip Ingram all over the BBC here in the UK, talking about all of the issues, cyber included, around the conflict in Russia and Ukraine. And it's my sincere wish, is probably everyone out there, that we can, bring that conflict to a conclusion and have peace break out and people can get back to their regular lives. We're going to be really digging into some interesting stuff in this presentation, and it's so great to have it back-ended by the best practices, because I'm going to be talking a little bit more around the generic threats, some of the issues around Active Directory deployment and Azure deployment and or hybrid deployments. But I want to get back into some of the history around Active Directory first. And that is to say that Novell NetWare, it's fair to say, and that might be a nostalgic thing for some folks in the audience, really set the stage for an organization along forest root, which is some of the same terminology we use in Active Directory. And to be fair, it's really interesting to talk about all of the effort that Microsoft has put in to Active Directory and then moving it into a cloud-based solution like Azure AD over many, many years of evolution. So, one of the challenges, but also one of the opportunities, is the fact that this product has really been around for at least 20 years plus in one form and another. And you can make the argument that Active Directory was really introduced way, way, way back in the day, and that's something that we'll also talk about now too. One of the problems that we are faced with is the increasing complexity of an Active Directory environment that also includes a ton of backwards compatible legacy technology as well. So as time has gone on, Active Directory has grown, it's been enhanced, it's had now security elements added to it, even though there was a bunch of security settings that could be deployed. And this was sort of the major, I would say, goal of Active Directory to supplant something like Novell NetWare, as that Novell NetWare did have a permissions-based model, and it did have a number of other security features. But Microsoft, even back in the NT and 2000 days, really focused on developing a very secure, robust operating system model for general computing within the Department of Defense networks for widespread computing, which then even to this day supplanted many a Novell NetWare implementation. Now, one of the things too is that the licensing model for Active Directory versus Novell was that when you bought Novell NetWare, you essentially had to purchase it in order to get all of the features of running this forest root creation, whereas Microsoft included it in the costs of the operating system, and it was really a sea change, if you will, in the philosophy behind building large corporate domains. And I think, to start this conversation, there are some underlying, I would say, must-haves in order for Active Directory to work properly within your organization. Time synchronization, I do a lot of security presentations, and one of the things that I'm always recommending, and this is mostly on the digital forensics and incident response side, is please make sure that you have robust time synchronization across your network so that your logs are all appropriately time-stamped. Nothing is worse than to try and do an incident response and having different times on different logs without central synchronization, because then it becomes an exercise in offsetting those times so you can see the chain of events that happened in order to investigate the breach itself, right? And there are critical underlying and unsecure protocols involved with Active Directory deployments and organization. One of the most common internet jokes and memes is it's not DNS, but it's always DNS. So domain name services are absolutely critical to the functioning and, I would say, the proper architecture for a good, solid Active Directory installation within your organization. And I note that back in the pre-Windows Server 2012 days, it was somewhat difficult in order, and you really needed to know what you were doing in order to have external DNS and run a Windows domain name server and not have any exposure. And also, if you were going to run a dedicated DNS server in your organization, it was absolutely critical that you knew what you're doing, because everything needed to be synced and everything needed to be found according to that DNS entry. And this is mostly because the larger your network, the more likely it is that you can survive on older depreciated protocols in terms of finding a network, a workstation. But in heavily saturated links, those protocols may not be able to seek out the domain controller, and you would have essentially orphaned workstations. The other important aspect of this is DHCP. Now, back in the day, the DHCP server was usually something running on the Windows server itself in order to manage and organize all the workstations. In many small medium networks now, DHCP is possibly run off the router or firewall, but DHCP is equally important in terms of identifying the server and affixing static IP addresses to a server. Because as you know, if you've installed a lot of Windows Active Directory and Windows servers, it don't like it very much if you try to assign a dynamic IP address to a server. That's a no-go there, and unfortunately can break things and cause things to not be able to communicate properly with each other. And Microsoft has added a lot of additional kind of Active Directory roles, including things like Global Catalog, Schema Master, Infrastructure Masters, and Forests and Roots, in order to be able to build the type of enterprise networks that folks are demanding that are cross-continent, cross-country, and global networks. So all of these type of things are important foundational pieces to getting AD and, of course, workstation health and maintain connections to Active Directory services. Now, this is one of the key takeaways that we're going to see that organizations are struggling with in a lot of ways. Windows 7 and Windows 10 can participate in what's called a secure server domain. This was, I think, introduced technically in 2012, but actually put into effect in Server 2016, where this is an elevated level of security and authentication of both the workstation's communications and the Active Directory itself. Previous to that, to support Windows XP, Windows 2000, Windows Vista, Windows NT even, all required legacy support, which really equals legacy protocols enabled. And this is bad, because back in the day, LAN-MAN and NetBIOS, and as it turns out, SMB v1, were very dangerous to the Windows AD environment for two very important reasons. One was you could Wireshark those networks for credentials, and you could also reverse engineer based on hashing. We'll talk a little bit about what that is moving forward in order for credentials as well. And, we saw basically the exploit over many, many years, but the most spectacular one being SMB v1, which was, of course, leveraged on port 445. Which, was leveraged by Eternal Blue and Double Pulsar and the whole bunch of NSA tools that led us to WannaCry, NotPetya, and Bad Rabbit attacks. Now, there are certain requirements for the workstation to work properly with the Windows domain. And one of them is, of course, the domain needs to be found. The DHCP scope has to be within the same scope as your server is available. The DNS of the workstation should be pointed at the server or the DNS that knows where that particular server is. And it's critical to ensure that there's communication between the domain controllers or the backup domain controllers with that particular workstation. There's been many a time where in order to do it on a local network, and this was pre-Windows Server 2012, where you needed to temporarily enable NetBIOS in order to join a Windows Active Directory domain, which of course was we needed to temporarily, we hope, degrade our security in order to get that workstation joined to the domain. This is especially true if you had made a mistake on the workstation, put in the wrong set of credentials, right? Or the DHCP server wasn't handing it out properly. Now, a lot of Windows initial problems with Windows Active Directory were all around the ability and stability of the DNS in the environment. And this remains true today. And this is why, in a lot of cases, clearing DNS cache on either the workstation or stopping and starting the DNS server on Windows domain servers was one of the quick and easy fixes for the organization. And that remains the case today, including, the time-honored tradition of unjoining the workstation and rejoining the workstation after deleting the workstation account on the actual server. It's amazing how that technique that we've used since Windows domains were invented still manages to clean up issues associated with workstation communication. Now, the fundamental part about Windows Active Directory, where it sort of parted company from Novell NetWare, was around the group policy objects that you could use leveraging Active Directory. And this was both an amazing tool for Windows administration, but also a very dangerous tool. Because with the increasing complexity that Microsoft instituted and their object model, where everything in Active Directory and group policies applied to different objects within the Microsoft domain, split along the lines of essentially machine-level group policy objects and user group policy objects, it became complicated to the extreme. And one of the things that you'll quickly find if you spend any time at all administering a Windows domain is that as you develop and change policies within your organization, documentation needs to be scrupulous. It also needs to understand that if you're changing something, there could be inherited group policy objects that bring that into conflict. So again, one of the best policies is not to go into your GPO structure and try and make all of the changes you require to meet your policies documents or your SOPs, your standard operating procedures of deployment, is not to make one GPO out of all of them, because trying to figure out where the conflicts are is going to require a lot of pain and agony, although there are some tools that we'll talk about that can help with that. But management then becomes a nightmare of trying to undo something. Now, managed service providers out there are frequently some of the most talented when it comes to group policy objects, because it's rare that you actually get to build a brand new domain and migrate PCs over to that domain. Instead, you're usually inheriting somebody else's mess. And if they haven't been scrupulous with this and have taken shortcuts and haven't created basically one GPO for all the global settings that they want to have happen, it's sometimes very difficult for a new person to come in and try to understand what's going on, okay? So it's critical to help out your brothers. Now, part of this whole effort of GPOs and Active Directory was really because, no, I'm not kidding you, Microsoft has always been serious when it comes to security. But one of the difficulties that group policy and AD objects have suffered from was as Microsoft introduced new security features into the operating system, like BitLocker, Windows Hello, AppLocker, GPOs, a lot of the cases where this technology in its initial introduction was not controllable by group policy objects and had either a console that needed to administer these features, right, or the amount of settings that were inherent in the new feature that they had put in did not have a complete set of GPO controls and required sometimes the infamous reg hacks that we're going to talk about to get them to behave properly. So one of the things that frequently happens, and this I think was one of the reasons why AppLocker, which was essentially Windows whitelisting, introduced in early builds of 2012, Server 2012, maybe even Server 2008. I think it was Server 2008. One of the problems we had is we couldn't really figure out a way to properly control AppLocker with group policy objects, and AppLocker was somewhat limited in what it could actually do, and it needed to be extended in order to work as a feature integrated into Windows Active Directory. So what happened was this great technology that Microsoft introduced was difficult to understand, difficult to deploy, and difficult to administer. That's why, in my belief, it wasn't really picked up particularly quickly and didn't really supplant any of the easier-to-use whitelisting applications, sort of at the security layer of your organization that you could purchase an add-on that would essentially graft itself onto your Active Directory so that you could control it. And this is one of the things where even though Microsoft really wants to put a single pane of glass on managing your organization, these third-party add-on tools became critical at scale in an organization to manage. So, from the small business perspective where you could, sneakernet around to 25, 50, or if you get an intern, 100 or more workstations to do specific configurations or install agents on those particular workstations, you had a viable solution. But at the enterprise level and at the enterprise organization level, to this very day, folks' standard operating procedures are going to be to use, in a lot of cases, a third-party tool to do all of the administration, right? In October of 2012, we have Windows 8 released. And Windows 8 essentially introduced for the first time in the Microsoft ecosystem antivirus product that went on to become the Windows Defender of Windows 7 and Windows 10. The huge difference here was the fact that Windows 8 now was completely able to be controlled and administered in Windows Active Directory, including the extensions to the technology of Windows Defender. And so this was really, really good news, because now you could essentially have what Tom's Hardware, and I put the Tom's Hardware review back in 2012 of Windows Defender, saying it was darn good, right? And so now what we had for the first time is something that was able to be controlled accurately from Windows, from the Windows Active Directory environment, extended in terms of the security down to the desktop, right? And that became really, really important. Now, the core value of Windows AD was that nested organization of users and system configurations. But we ran into a problem. And this problem manifested itself in the NTFS file permissions at the hard drive level, if you will, of nested directories and user access. And so one of the challenges was getting those two things to line up. And I remember doing Windows administration and building shares on file servers, where literally the share permissions and the NTF permissions, I ended up having to synchronize both. Because what I wanted to ensure was not only was the shares working properly and the permissions for those shares working properly, I also wanted to make sure that the NTFS permissions matched those share permissions. So as example, user directories, you'd have a share, and you'd make that share basically only inheritable by the named user, but you also had to ensure that that share permission were also set for that user. Otherwise, you made this great share, and out of the box, you couldn't even connect to it, which was a very frustrating exercise. So, I think from my perspective, what I've seen is sort of like AD provided you all the tools to do these great things, but then there were inherent things in the Windows operating system that wouldn't let you do them without modification. And again, in the early days of AD, security features were difficult to access, difficult to configure. They had lots of double negatives that, turn this off to enable this. And they're like, well, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense. Why don't they just say, turn this on to enable this, right? And so there was a lot of difficulty in interpreting exactly what was. And as a result of that, there was a lot of folks that experimented or made a change, and it had dramatic effects on the organization, right? And then Microsoft, I think, started down a long road of recognizing sort of the gaps and the issues when it came to Windows Active Directory management. And I talked about, the third-party apps that you would end up having to deploy to make it work at enterprise scale. And we had the era of reg hacks, that Microsoft's solution in a lot of cases to short-term fixes was to give you a reg hack. Well, reg hacks were relatively easy to deploy in enterprise environments up until the point you realized that you'd had to modify the registry on all sorts of machines globally, which would require some scripting madness and capability. In small business, it wasn't too bad, because at the end of the day, you could take your .reg file, remote onto computers, put it on a share, log in as the administrator, and double-click it, and boom, you were good to go. But again, it didn't scale as nearly as comfortable it would, which also brings up the point of administering the deployment of applications within a large enterprise, in that the particular skill set you needed in order to do that was to create these MSI files that were then published in various versions of what I call an application library that users could go to and then self-deploy that particular package or update that they required, right? Now, I've been in enterprise networks where the team that does that, there's literally an app scripting team that builds MSI packages for the hundreds of applications that are used throughout a Windows environment. That skill set is a high-level programmer skill set that blends system administration with basically being able to do Windows scripting back in the day, or command line scripting, or even now PowerShell work. So this is sort of like where you almost had one foot in the world of programming and one foot in the world of application packaging as part of system administration. Later on, vendors got a little bit more friendly and started including MSI packages as sort of part of their offering to make it a bit easier on the scripting people. But the problem is that you needed something called an answer file created based on that Windows application install to answer any default questions that application might prompt you to do. So, I mean, this was an art. This was really, really an art and required advanced skill sets, even at the small, medium enterprise level. Now, one of the things that blew everybody's mind out there, and it's 25 years old now, which just blows my mind, was sysinternals, right? By Mark Rusovich, who is a genius. There's no question about his genius. Like on the scale of geniuses, he's somewhere slightly below Nikola Tesla, okay? He is brilliant. Now, what we used to do before a lot of us found out about sysinternals was really to figure out what was going on update. We had a test workstation. We would GP update force it and wait for a reboot to see what happened, and then try again endlessly in order to figure out how to debug Active Directory. Within sysinternals was the introduction of a bunch of tools that can help for Windows domain. And to this very day, sysinternals is maintained because as Windows Active Directory has gotten either more complex, or we're trying to clean up a bunch of legacy things within Windows Active Directory, or we need a bunch of information, be it queries to Active Directory. Sometimes even your mad scripting skills require the deployment of a tool in order to get the information out of it. And I remember for compliance purposes, this was way back in the day, we needed stale accounts and last logged in accounts. And there was magic required in order to get the Windows Active Directory, which actually had that information available, into a coherent report that you could hand to compliance in order to make sure you were meeting your standard operating procedures of user account creation, what permissions that user account had, and also when the last login time was, especially critical for insider threat investigations or digital forensics incident response. And that was nothing that came out of the Windows box itself. And Microsoft, in a way, a bit failed on that one, and certainly didn't make it easy to put all of that information into one place, which is a bit of a foreshadow of what I'm going to talk about in the next couple of slides. Now, there were also Microsoft security things that they brought into the table that were nearly outside of Windows Active Directory, right? So one of them was Windows Server Update Services, okay, which is essentially patch management for the Windows ecosystem. And was it integrated in Active Directory? Well, sort of. I'm just going to say it wasn't particularly reliable. It consumed a lot of bandwidth because it had to download all the patches to a central repository. Now, I'm not going to totally diss it because some organizations are actually still using it, but I will tell you this, they have probably spent a ton of effort and time making sure it's stabilized, making sure it was performance. It was post-traumatic stress inducing to have Windows Update Server introduced in Windows small business servers because it required SQL, it required Internet Information, IIS, or Internet Information Services, and it required a bunch of extra heavy Active Directory components in order to make it work. And so this was a great intention, don't get me wrong, because I'm a huge fan of patch management and vulnerability management, but it was so poorly executed that there were many third parties that were superior to it. And as our ecosystem evolved beyond Microsoft into the realms of Adobe and Flash and other browsers and the requirements to do updates, it was very difficult to get the Windows Update servers to do third party, right? So, again, we had this issue around vulnerability management. Then we had this other piece of technology from Microsoft, which I think they actually bought from somebody else and did like a minimum viable product integration, was called the Baseline Security Analyzer. Think really early Nessus. A vulnerability scanner, again, pretty much confined to the Windows ecosystem, had no support for IoT, Macs, or Android. It was essentially, in my mind, a compliance tool, or to tell you how poorly your Windows Update Services WAS box was performing. Okay, so its intent was there, but again, the execution of both pieces of software and the fact that neither one was integrated into Windows Active Directory or a group policy object where you could say scan this part of my organization or all the computers under the accounting workstation on a regular basis and present a report. So again, we were sort of missing that one pane of glass security administration, even though we really tried to get there under the systems management with a whole bunch of extra third-party tools and sysinternals in terms of one pane of glass of management. And then we evolved, again, Microsoft does this. They surprise us with absolutely expanding a feature to the point where no one can kind of figure out how it worked. And this happened with the introduction of the new Windows firewall on server, I believe it was, you were looking at server 2008, where I don't know what level of sort of like knowledge you would need to figure out actually what you need turned on and what you actually could turn off without a ton of experimentation. But man, this was a huge thing that was, again, not really integrated into group policy objects, needed to be kind of hand-tuned based on your organization. And what ended up happening is a lot of applications, even to this very day, is you install the application and it asks your permission to open a port on the firewall out to the internet. And unless you're paying careful attention to that, and you are actually restricted in terms of privileges from executing that, you can end up compromising your workstation by pushing a piece of software to somebody in an email that has local administrative privileges on the machine. So again, even though we had the AD there and we had all these AD features, we were really kind of struggling with that whole administration approach. And, I said, what we've seen Microsoft evolve into was really, is this an operating system with a security solution, or is Microsoft now a security solution that bundles an operating system with it, right? And we've seen them react to the marketplace with one of the big keys, which is the removal of SMB v1 to try and push you into a more secure domain that disables the unsecure protocols to a certain extent. There's still some crazy stuff that you can do, like bind our remote procedure call, RPC, to HTTP unencrypted, which sounds like a terrible idea from a security perspective, right? But again, we're seeing Microsoft react to the fact that they're admitting that old is vulnerable and old should only be installed, basically to maintain business operations. And we've seen, the failures, too, of Microsoft, where Active Directory GPOs can play a powerful way of managing your workstation infrastructure by turning off vulnerable services that may or may not be needed. Okay, Spooler service, obviously needed for printing, but there are many computers in your organization that may never need to print. The server service is running by default on every workstation. It's been attacked since 2008 in terms of exploits. The workstation and service, even older, has been attacked since 2006. And of course, there might be a requirement for some, especially in graphic design shops or something like that, to install fonts on the machine. But again, the font services have been attacked on 2015, and you probably don't need to be running the font service on your actual servers themselves, especially on Windows Active Directory servers, so you can lock that one down, hopefully without blowing up your entire Windows server. Right. Now what happens, which is kind of interesting, is that our security model has kind of changed quite a bit, depending on the type of shop that you're in, right? So we've gone to hardening workstations, building a moat in castle, building a taller castle wall and a wider moat with all the security stuff that we had. Now Microsoft has introduced the ability to basically manage Azure Active Directory, which is essentially taking your Active Directory and pushing it into the cloud, right? Well, that is interesting from the attack surface being changed from defense in depth to IDAM, right? And to identity and access management, which is essentially making sure that now your Active Directory in the cloud in Azure is not only should it be monitored by Azure Sentinel, but it should be protected by multi-factor authentication and single sign-on for actual defense in depth. Because it's different now, because your firewalls aren't really going to protect you from an AD compromise in the cloud when changes can be made to your AD in Azure that then are replicated down onto your workstation and potentially server estate as well. And one of the most important things to understand is this Wired article, because the way Maersk recovered from their attack was they were able to find an intact, unransomwared Active Directory server, and from that one server that was, I think, located in Ghana, Africa, and the reason it wasn't attacked by the ransomwares was on a saturated link and never got infected, mostly because the link was saturated with traffic, they were able to reconstruct their whole Active Directory, which saved them weeks of effort at an organization that size to recover, and that suddenly became the most important corporate asset on the planet for Maersk. Fascinating story. Highly recommend you read that about the importance of resiliency when it comes to your Active Directory infrastructure. So Microsoft has now decided, whether you liked it or not, they didn't really talk to anyone about this, but they essentially decided that system administration now equal system security, right? Which has now had profound implications for the industry in training, architecture, compliance reporting, and relationships with vendors. I specifically call out relationships with vendors because at the time, especially in the small, medium business world, we were asked to disable security and whitelist applications and poke holes in our firewalls in order to accommodate a third-party application with the environment. That seems and is now proven to have been a terrible idea completely and caused no end of grief for folks hoping to meet compliance requirements or just doing a security audit for something like PCI DSS and finding that there were major gaps that could have compliance ramifications and or presented holes for a data breach. We've all seen those applications that require an ancient version of Java, an ancient version of .NET, or an ancient version of, God forbid, Flash, in order to run in a local admin at best, and sometimes domain admin context at worst, if it was a client-server application. And for a period of time, one of the most exploitable organizations on the planet were law firms and dental offices because the vendors saw fit to require those elevated privileges and outdated software to run on your network. So every vulnerability scan that you ever did came back with red all over the place, right? And you're seeing that old Active Directory users and computers going back to, I think that looks like Windows 2000 or even Windows NT screenshot. So it's been around for a really, really long time. So now is the big da-na-da-na, okay? The da-na-da-na is that as far as Microsoft is concerned, system configuration, security, and Azure Active Directory are now going to be in the cloud. And you kind of have options for sure, but if you really want to leverage everything that Microsoft tried to cobble together with either sort of a half-assed approach to Active Directory integration with security tools, So now when we look at what Microsoft is putting up there in the cloud, it is not just about users and computers. It's about managing all of the applications that are on that endpoint, including broad spectrum of vulnerability management, including third-party software. It's about managing configurations, right? Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager, right? It's about getting those analytics for your compliance team. And deployment services have never been easier in this new Microsoft Endpoint Manager suite, which includes, of course, your identity management under Azure AD. So what they've done is sort of Microsoft Intune is where you go to manage both your cloud and on-premises boxes, and Azure AD has now become sort of the stop to manage those secure identities across your estate. This is a sea change in how we used to approach Windows Active Directory, where it was sort of all under one lid. Now, some folks will argue that they were far more comfortable in the old school days, and I will remind them that just like the sunset of Microsoft Exchange on-premise, although it hasn't happened yet, but we can see it coming, especially after a nonstop amount of Microsoft 0 days, as a threat. So as we sort of go along this, there's a snapshot of securing Azure Active Directory. What we're seeing here is your ability to manage things in the cloud. Now, of course, management to the cloud requires connectivity to the cloud, right? So in a lot of cases, you have to make sure that your internet connections are high speed and reliable, which is not necessarily as much of a problem as it used to be when we had really constrained and saturated links. And now, in a lot of cases, we can get 100 meg or even 50 meg downloads speeds easily, because now what we're doing is essentially pushing changes down from the cloud to workstations instead of workstations having to query and say, is there anything new for me? Although they kind of still do that, but it's like differential rather than going through all of their settings and then, sending all of their settings back to a central server. So we've gotten a lot more efficient when it comes to management in the cloud. And I think this is the way to go because of the extra redundancy that Azure presents us in terms of it's running on Microsoft infrastructure. It is generally high availability as opposed to, all of the eggs in one basket on an on-premise, physical server that is possibly, beige colored. One of my vulnerability assessments is if I see the color beige, I'm like, that's got to go. And if it says the word Proliant on it, it also has to go. And so what Microsoft is seeking, I think, in their overall efforts now is this convergence into a single pane of glass for management and security, with the idea that configuration is for compliance and dashboards are for security, right? Which really informs the budget of a company because we're constrained, right? Most IT departments and security departments are shelling out about 70% of their total budgets for the salaries of the folks, right? And then they have 20% of that remaining budget to just renew their software with 10% of discretionary spend that has to be put on training and everything else. So Microsoft brilliantly decided to start adding a bunch of free management and free security tools into the operating system through their subscription-based models in order to give you, as a security team or as an IT team, more value, if you will, so that they can get a bigger spend overall of what traditionally was a security tool budget versus an IT management budget. So by putting it all into one hood, they give you all these kind of sexy security tools, but also include all of the management tools. However, one bit of bad news, Mimcat still seems to work on a whole bunch of boxes. So this is still a lot of work to go. They do a good job, especially if you're running Windows Defender APT, from stopping these attacks. But I'm telling you, invoke PowerShell and EDR bypass is still a thing. So, we've still seen the fact that once a malicious actor gets onto the endpoint, no matter where your Active Directory is or no matter how hard you've made that box, some of the same techniques that we've seen from way back in the day absolutely still pawn boxes. Now, just a couple of examples, and I've included it in the deck just to show you that I kind of know what I'm talking about. But one of the things that organizations relied on Active Directory to do was really configure what their standard operating procedures were and or what their policy builds needed to be. So I know I'm running a little bit beyond time because we want to give some time for questions and stuff. So these are really from that small business experience that I would say most of my eye teeth were cut on, in that a lot of what we had to do in small, medium business to make applications work was run them at local administrative privileges. And local administrative privileges, as you know, are a major problem because, well, to be fair, users can make changes, unauthorized changes, and they can install software. And even with adjustments on permissions to certain directories, and even with trying to elevate them to super user level, we still found that back in the old days of client-server architecture, primarily given away by the fact that if I say the words .ini file, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, or for even older school people, ODBC links. We know what we're talking about there in terms of linking PCs to applications to database servers somewhere else in the organization in a really complicated, unpleasant, and unreliable manner over, in a lot of cases, unsecure communications means, such as named pipes. We get into the fact that there is a necessity to configure the desktops in a hardened fashion while still giving local administrative privileges away on the box. So what these were, including the ability of the user to open the access, the control panel, preventing Windows from storing the LAN manager hash, which we said was a hash that could be used to reverse engineer passwords that have been used on the particular box. So again, if your box suffered a compromise and they were able to deploy a tool like Jack the Ripper back in the day to essentially decryptify or de-encrypt the landman hash of the administrator account password. This is a fun thing we used to do back in the security audit days. Controlling access to the command prompt, controlling access to PowerShell, very important. And these are big ones that you can set up alerts and audits on in order to prevent your box from getting popped, because you'll know when a user decided to try and open up command prompt or PowerShell, and you can ask them kindly, what they needed, or is there any way that you could help them? And if you find there's no response, it might be a good idea to go down there and see what's going on, right? We've talked about the dangers of removable media. It does still exist. It's still a viable attack surface. So, even though we had users running at local administrative privileges, we could still provide a bit of security, especially around this compliance item for PCI DSS, which didn't want you to be able to use removable media drives, et cetera, et cetera. Restricting software installations. To say it was inconvenient to just turn off the installer service on all of your workstations, it was massively inconvenient because it would also affect your patch management and running other applications that maybe needed to run on the workstation. So again, this is a way of restricting the user to do that. And then finally, because of compliance requirements, setting a minimum password length was one of the frequently things done in Windows Active Directory in order to meet compliance requirements. So we get there now to what have we learned so far? Well, right now, I think we're living in a world where we really, really want to try and isolate the bad guys from getting to at least from the IT perspective, the the high value part of the network, which is the Windows Active Directory server, right? The crown jewels of your network. So a lot of folks are using things like a physical Active Directory machine being physically secured, using a remote desktop connection that's logged in with elevated privileges so that your Windows IT team isn't using domain level privileges on their endpoints, right? So again, what you're doing is you're breaking that chain, you're allowing them to do their jobs, but you're using a remote desktop server with the tools installed on it and not letting them deploy the Windows admin tools onto their own desktops. We have Microsoft realizing that in an enterprise environment that might not be good enough, so they have created things like Microsoft Privileged Access Management, Microsoft Identity Management, and just-in-time administration, which grants domain admins time-limited access at the domain-level privileges in order to accomplish their tasks, and then once they're done, that expires. It's all good practices. It's all around the fact that we're constantly attacked by MIMCATs as part of sophisticated either cyber criminal or advanced persistent threat actor attacks. And finally, what we can do in even increased security is use something called memory integrity or hypervisor protected code integrity. This is a way of running Windows in a hypervisor environment to isolate the various system attack paths, especially on the kernel. But this suffered an enormous setback when that setting decided to start corrupting, blowing up, and otherwise locking hypervisors up. So it became a very dangerous tool unless you tested it and unless you've experienced those kind of pain. So be forewarned, even though I believe it's just a checkmark box, it was originally turned on by default. So if you're not having any problems right now, no need to degrade your security. But if you are having some craziness with regards to running Windows Active Directory and administrating Windows Active Directory in a hypervisor environment, this thing, memory integrity, is probably one of the things that you need to disable if it was from back in the day enabled, and it might stabilize the whole thing. Hard lesson to learn, let me tell you. And again, one of the ways that we can really increase our security on Active Directory across our estate is to really audit and make sure an audit policy is engaged and deploy them via group policy in order to audit specific events that match the MITRE attack framework in order to figure out whether or not we have indications of compromise. And I highlighted a few that if you're seeing scheduled tasks created, if you're seeing scheduled tasks updated, if you're seeing new services installed on a system or an audit log being cleared, you better have a change ticket or a service ticket in ServiceNow or whatever you're using, because if that stuff is happening randomly in your organization, you have a major problem on your hands. All right. And again, what we've seen is there are, Azure Sentinel being one, a lot of solutions out there. Lionfish is one of the ones that we've chosen in the small, medium business space to consume Active Directory logs and create a bunch of rules that create alerts if we see craziness in your Active Directory. So, just one tiny little story, and then we'll get to the Q&A portion. We've got 5 great minutes. As you probably are aware, Lapis Group, a number of people were arrested, but they showed that no matter how good your security is, if you've been breached, if you have poor internal controls, and even multi-factor approval, your organization needs to put security awareness first and foremost, because this group, the Lapis Group, used all kinds of attacks to bypass even the best EDR and the best Active Directory configurations you could possibly come up with when it comes to security. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to David for all the amazing questions that you might have to ask.
Okay, great job. And we do have some questions. First one comes from Tina. Let's get right to it. For the HVCI and running AD, was that for Hyper-V, or did you see issues on VMware too?
I think it was Hyper-V, although I know that VMware too has had some issues that were kind of similar to this. And this is also an issue with certain older generations of the Intel Xenons, where the memory access could create a corruption. And I think, to be fair, this goes back to the hodgepodges of packages of different vulnerabilities we've seen with Spectre and then Rowhammer attacks on the hardware that our infrastructure has been running on. So it's almost like a VM escape, if you will, in terms of a vulnerability. But I do know that there was a bunch of microcode released for the Microsoft operating system that addressed that issue. I suspect the same thing was put into the latest patches and updates of VMware.
Okay, we have time for one more question, but it's a very important question, and it deals with money like everything else in our lives. The question reads, the most elusive issue I have with IT is how much are all the fancy Microsoft things you talk about going to cost?
So one of the most difficult things is figuring out exactly how much things cost in the Microsoft world. This is sort of like where IT, if you can give your IT department one thing, it's a test lab so that they can figure out sort of what's included, what's not included, what is an actual service or a solution that they may have to pay an additional cost to or purchase outright. So the best thing you could possibly do is get tight with your procurement folks, work with whatever Microsoft expert, be it a sales or distributor that you buy your Microsoft solutions from, and kind of work through it in a test lab first to see basically how much it's going to cost. I do know that with Office 365 accounts and with operating system subscriptions, you get Azure AD bundled with it. But there's a caveat to that. All of the advanced features, such as the reporting and compliance, may not be included depending on what level, like E3, E1, small business, etc., or E5, which usually includes everything under the hood as advertised, included. So when embarking upon these things to look at sort of like what the art of the possible is and what those costs are, you really do have to kind of set up a test lab and deploy the various features and products and see, which ones suddenly pop up the screen that say, oh, you have to have this licensing in order for it to work. It sucks. It really does, but it's a fair amount of work.
Okay. Thanks again, Ian, for an excellent presentation and answering those questions. And that's a wrap. Everyone else, stay tuned. We're going to take a short break and be back at the top of the hour for our second session of the day, Best Practices for Securing Active Directory and Azure AD. So take a break, check out those resources on your console provided by our sponsors, and we'll be right back.
Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers, to my fellow moderators, and of course, our sponsors for today, Ativo Networks, Chaosoft, Imanami, Zoho, and JumpCloud for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you all this great content. My name is Gladys Rama. I am the editorial director, and I am here to moderate the second session of our Securing Azure AD and Active Directory Summit. This one is called Best Practices for Securing Active Directory and Azure AD. Our speaker for this session is Brian Posey. He's a 20-time Microsoft MVP and a technology writer. Throughout his career, Brian has written or contributed to dozens of IT books and created numerous full-length video training courses and published thousands of blog posts on a huge variety of IT and space-related topics. Many of those blog posts can be found on resinmag.com in his Cozy Tips and Tricks column, or in his new Cozy's Moonshot column, where he talks about his adventures in commercial spaceflight training. Brian, take it away.
Hey, thank you so much, Gladys. So unfortunately, I didn't get to hear the previous session, but I hear it was really fantastic, so I wish I'd gotten to check that out. But, you know, when it comes to something like Active Directory security, it's really good that the people at Redmond have set it up so that there are multiple sessions, because just to give you a little background on the way this normally works, typically someone from the editorial staff will contact me and say, hey, can you speak about such and such topic? And then there's some prep work and a presentation, and the whole thing's fairly low-key. But when it comes to Active Directory security, that's one of those topics that is both critically important and super pervasive. There have been giant full-length books that have been written on the topic, and we're still probably not touched on everything. So it's one of these super hard to fit everything in. So I'm really glad that we're having multiple sessions on this. But, you know, when I started preparing for this, I wasn't quite sure where to begin, and my mind actually flashed to something that was totally unrelated and yet oddly connected. As Gladys mentioned a moment ago, I've spent the last 7 years training to go to space. And because of my background with astronautics, sometimes I get asked to speak at schools and science museums and things like that on the subject of astronautics. Well, I did a presentation a couple of years ago, and I'll never forget this. I had barely even said good morning to the crowd, and there was a little girl in the front row who raised her hand, and it seemed like kind of an odd time for a question. But I was curious what she had in her mind, so I went ahead and called on her. And her question was, are you going to tell us to study math and science? I kind of had to chuckle to myself, because you really can't do astronautics or pretty much anything with the space program without a strong math and science background. But I asked her why she said that, and she said, well, every time they bring in somebody to talk to us, they always tell us study math and science. And the reason why that kind of reminds me of the whole Active Directory thing is the whole concept of studying math and science. That's a really hard truth behind certain career paths. But when it comes to Active Directory security, there are a lot of hard truths that are really hard to swallow. And that's a lot of what I'm going to be presenting today. I'm going to give you a lot of techniques that you can use and hopefully take back and put into practice. But there are some things that might not necessarily be so easy to digest that you're really going to have to just bite the bullet and take an honest look at if you truly want to get to the heart of your security state with your Active Directory. So that's where we're going to go today. So to start out with some of those hard truths, I thought it might be fun to start by talking about the 10 immutable laws of security, and this is version 2.0 of this list. And just for full disclosure, I didn't come up with this list. This is something that I found on LinkedIn, and it was originally, I believe, from Microsoft. Now, not everything on this list applies explicitly to Active Directory. It's just kind of IT security in general. But well over half of these concepts that I'm about to discuss could be applied to Active Directory. So I really think it's worth the time to go through the list, because this list is about as frank as you're ever going to get. So law number 1, if a bad guy can persuade you to run his program on your computer, it's not solely your computer anymore. Law number 2, if a bad guy can alter the operating system on your computer, it's not your computer anymore. And law number 3, if a bad guy has unrestricted physical access to your computer, it's not your computer anymore. And incidentally, I will be talking about physical security a little bit later on. Law number 4, if you allow a bad guy to run active content on your website, it's not your website anymore. Law 5, weak passwords trump strong security. And I would actually add to that I think the inverse of that is also true. Weak security can trump strong passwords. I've seen it happen time and time again. Law number 6, a computer is only as secure as the administrator is trustworthy. That's another one of those really hard truths, and one of the subjects that I'm going to be talking about later on is compartmentalization of administrative responsibilities. Law number 7, encrypted data is only as secure as its decryption key. So if you have a weak encryption key, you're going to have weak encryption. That's potentially easy to break. Law number 8, an out-of-date anti-malware scanner is only marginally better than no scanner at all. Law number 9, absolute anonymity, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, isn't practically achievable online or offline. And law number 10, technology is not a panacea. And I really like law number 10, because what that's really saying is that no matter how good a solution might be, that solution isn't going to do anything if you have bad practices put into place. So just something to think about as we go along. Now, when we start talking about Active Directory security can really be categorized into two categories. The first one being infrastructure security, and that's things like server hardening and physical security and all of that good stuff. The second one is logical security. And when I think of logical security, what I really think of is your Active Directory structure and the permissions and all the groups that you create, your administrative practices that go along with the Active Directory, and things like that. And I'm going to be kind of alternating back and forth between the two. There might be a little bit more coverage on infrastructure security than logical security, but I am going to be talking about both. But one of the things that I want to talk about with regard to logical security right off the bat is you may have things in your Active Directory that have been there forever that aren't necessarily the best way of doing things. So what do I mean by that? Well, think about the history of Active Directory for a moment. Active Directory was introduced with Windows 2000, which was released way back in 1999. And before that, we had Windows NT Server. And Windows NT Server didn't have Active Directory. It hadn't been invented yet, but it had its own concept of a domain environment. And there was a procedure back in the day to upgrade from Windows NT to Windows 2000 and to migrate the contents of your domains over to the Windows 2000 Active Directory environment. Windows NT has been around since 1993, so 1 year shy of 30 years. So why does all this matter? Well, think about it in the context of a company that's been long established. A company that's been around for generations, maybe they started out using something non-Microsoft, maybe Novell NetWare or something like that, and eventually they adopted Windows NT. They put a domain into place, and then when Windows 2000 came along, they did a migration over to Windows 2000, brought all of their domain stuff with them, and then perhaps put some additional infrastructure in place to support the Active Directory. Over the years, as new server releases came along, that got upgraded over and over and over again. Now here we are 30 years later, and even though the environment today barely resembles what we had way back in the days of Windows NT or Windows 2000, there may be legacy elements that are still in that Active Directory environment from so long ago. I'm really talking about things like permissions that shouldn't be there. So even though it's an overwhelming task, it may be worth your time to go in and take a really good, hard, honest look at the permissions in your Active Directory environment that have been carried over year after year from one server version to the next, and just see if those are really what they should be. So that's what I meant earlier when I said I was going to be covering some hard truths. I also want to kind of start out by talking about one of Microsoft's, or never mind. A lot of what I'm going to cover in this presentation is going to be quoting Microsoft's own best practices directly off their website, because I want you to be able to hear a lot of these best practices directly from the horse's mouth. So let's start about it, talking about infrastructure security a little bit, and I'm focusing primarily on on-premises environments, although a lot of what I'm going to be talking about will obviously work in Azure AD as well. So one of the first things that you need to consider when it comes to hardening your Active Directory environment is, what is it that needs to be hardened? Well, obviously you're going to have to harden your domain controllers. That's a given. But one of the things that sometimes gets neglected is servers running Azure AD Connect. Now, for anybody who might not be familiar with Azure AD Connect, it's a service that synchronizes the contents of an on-premises Active Directory environment up to the Azure Active Directory. And that's the case whether you're using, or excuse me, I don't want to go there. So anyway, the reason why I wanted to mention Azure AD Connect is because the Azure AD Connect server contains sensitive information. I mean, after all, it is synchronizing your Active Directory environment up to the cloud. But a lot of times Azure AD Connect tends to be neglected, and I think one of the big reasons for that is it's one of those things that's super simple to deploy, like way more so than you would probably expect it to be. I mean, really all you have to do is download the Azure AD Connect software, and then it asks you for an administrative account for your local Active Directory environment. It asks you for Azure Cloud credentials, and bam, it goes off and does its thing. That it literally is that simple. You can have the whole thing up and running in probably 5 minutes or so. And because of its simplicity, a lot of people will set it up and then just forget all about it. My advice would be to treat your Azure AD Connect server like a domain controller. Secure it the same way that you would secure a domain controller because it really does contain a lot of sensitive information. Incidentally, I hadn't really planned on talking about this, but one thing that I will throw out there really quickly before I move on is that in an Azure AD and on-premises Active Directory environment, Azure AD Connect gives you the ability to take a look at what you're synchronizing and kind of pick and choose. And I would recommend against synchronizing privileged accounts that are used exclusively on premises up to the Azure AD environment, because really there's no reason to have those accounts up in the cloud. So that's just one little change you might be able to make to improve your security a bit. So what else? Well, I would recommend seeing what you can do to harden your DNS servers so as to avoid DNS poisoning attacks. And then any other infrastructure components that are used in the management of your Active Directory environment, any kind of management servers that you might use, management endpoints, things like that. So let's talk about physical security. When we talk about physical security, that goes back to those rules that I covered at the very beginning. I believe it was rule number 3 that essentially says if an attacker has access to your physical machine, it's not your machine. Now, we all like to think that nobody who works in our organization would do anything to tamper with a server. But believe it or not, this is something that I've run into in the real world. One of my first jobs in IT, it was actually my second job, I was working as an administrator at an insurance company, and there were several administrators. And one of those administrators was a rogue. They were constantly going in and sabotaging things. So things like this really do happen in the real world. So because of that, physical security is important. It's not just somebody coming in off of the street and messing with something. You could have employees that would do that sort of thing. So you've got to make sure that your domain controllers are physically secured to where they can't be tampered with by anybody who doesn't explicitly need direct access to those servers. So when it comes to physical security, you have to handle it a little bit differently depending on whether the domain controllers are running on physical hardware or running on virtual hardware. The information on this slide comes from Microsoft's own best practices, and this pertains to domain controllers running on physical hardware, which is still kind of a rarity these days, but I think it's still worth covering. So what do we got? Install domain controllers into racks and cages that are separate from the general server population. So that way you're keeping everything isolated, and somebody who has access to maintain your servers doesn't necessarily have access to your domain controllers. Then we have domain controllers should be configured with Trusted Platform Module, TPM chips, and all volumes in the domain controller server should be protected via BitLocker. So not only does BitLocker encryption help protect you against hard drive theft, but it can also help protect against things like rootkits. Because if somebody were to go in and install a rootkit or something that messes with the boot volume, well, then that's going to cause BootLocker to break, and the server is going to be booted into recovery mode. Now, one word of caution is that BitLocker can't be used on software RAID volumes, iSCSI devices, or SAN or NAS storage, or on dynamic volumes. And you'll notice I listed the source of this down at the bottom. A lot of the slides that I'm going to be presenting come directly from Microsoft. And I've provided the link to the original source for all of these in case you want to go back and check those out for yourself. Now, in a virtualized environment where your domain controllers are all virtualized, a lot of the same basic principles apply, but you have to do things just a little bit differently. And in all honesty, a lot of this really comes down to budget, because some of the advice that Microsoft gives is great for security, but it might not necessarily be practical for an organization that is budget constrained. But I still wanted to present it just for due diligence. So virtualization, what can you do? Ensure that the domain controllers run on separate physical hosts than other virtual machines in the environment. So that way, if you've got a virtualization administrator that manages all your virtual servers, they're not able to interact with your domain controllers. You've got dedicated staff dealing with those virtualized domain controllers. Delegate administration for the physical host on which domain virtual machines reside, or domain controller virtual machines reside, and the domain controllers themselves to authorized administrators. So we're talking about compartmentalization of administrative responsibilities. Separate the storage of virtual domain controllers to prevent storage admins from accessing the virtual machine files. So in other words, having separate physical hosts isn't enough. You should also use separate physical storage, just so that your storage admins can't access the files associated with your virtualized domain controllers. And then use shielded virtual machines if you're using Hyper-V. A virtual machine shielding is a Hyper-V feature that makes it so that a virtual machine can only be brought up on an authorized host. An admin can't steal a copy of the virtual machine and then boot it up on a lab server at home. So those are some of the best practices as they pertain to server virtualization and domain controllers. So what about domain controllers in branch offices and remote locations? Ideally, there never should be such a thing, but in the real world, there's a very real need for it sometimes. Because let's face it, if you've got a branch office and you've got, 100 people in that branch office and their internet connection goes down, they may not be able to log in or access certain resources unless they've got access to a domain controller on site. And even if that's not the case, if they can use cached credentials on their workstations to log in, having that domain controller on site is still going to reduce the traffic that's passing across their internet connection or their WAN connection back to the corporate office. So sometimes having a domain controller in a branch office or in a remote location is a necessary evil. If you do have to have that, then the same basic rules apply. Use BitLocker on the domain controller, lock the doors around it, do what you can to physically secure the domain controller. And then Microsoft also goes on to say that if you're not able to secure that domain controller in that branch office to the same level that you would in your own data center, then make it a read-only domain controller. A read-only domain controller is essentially just a domain controller that can be used to read values from the Active Directory database, but changes can't be made to it. So that way, if that domain controller is compromised, it reduces the risk because that is a read-only domain controller. So what about the operating system running on your domain controllers? Well, what Microsoft recommends is to use a server core deployment of Windows Server and to only perform management operations remotely using dedicated hardened endpoints. So server core means run Windows Server without a GUI, and really that's a best practice for most of the Windows servers that you deploy. Although I know a lot of people, myself included, really prefer to have that GUI environment available. But in the case of a domain controller, I think it makes a lot of sense to operate it as a server core deployment because it does two things. One, if you're operating it as a server core, you're reducing the potential attack surface because you've unloaded all of the binaries that have to do with the GUI interface. So you've shrunken the size of the server, reduced the attack surface. But the other thing that you've done is you've essentially forced remote management of that domain controller. Nobody's going to sit down at the server console and manage it from there. Yes, they could do it with PowerShell, but if they're going to do it with PowerShell, that could just as easily be done from a remote station. If you're doing any kind of GUI-based management, you would have to do that remotely from another machine. But notice the second bullet point on the slide. Microsoft is saying that you should only perform management operations remotely using dedicated hardened endpoints. So as an administrator, you don't want to sit down at the same desktop that you use to check your email and to browse the internet and use that desktop to manage your domain controllers. That's bad practice. What you want to do is have a hardened workstation that you use solely for those management tasks and use that to do all of your domain controller management. And sorry if I sound a little bit funny. I live in the South. It's kind of raining pollen here, so my throat's kind of acting up today. So what about patch management? Well, patch management isn't really anything new. We all know that Microsoft releases patches every month on Patch Tuesday, and then those patches need to be applied in a timely manner in order to keep our environment secure. I'm not telling you anything that you don't know. But what does Microsoft say about patch management when it comes to securing your Active Directory environment? Well, check out this quote. This came directly off of Microsoft's website, word for word. And I know it's probably a little small on the slide, so I'll go ahead and read this. Although it may seem counterintuitive, you should consider patching domain controllers and other critical infrastructure components separately from general Windows infrastructure. If you leverage enterprise configuration management software for all computers in your infrastructure, compromise of the system's management software can be used to compromise or destroy all infrastructure components managed by that software. By separating patch management systems management for domain controllers from the general population, you can reduce the amount of software installed on domain controllers in addition to tightly controlling their management. So that's a mouthful. What this is really getting down to is that let's say that you use a WSUS server to deploy patches to all of the systems in your environment. That's great. That's normally the way that things are done. But what Microsoft is saying here is that if somebody happens to find a way of compromising that WSUS server and deploying a malicious patch, which in all fairness, I've never heard of anybody actually pulling that off. Maybe they have, but I haven't heard of it. But if somebody managed to do that, well then they're not only going to be able to attack your normal servers, they're also going to be able to attack your domain controllers in that way. So what Microsoft is really getting at here is that maybe you want to have a separate patch management solution in place just for domain controllers. And I would add in your Azure AD Connect servers as well. Then we get into RDP configuration. RDP, for anybody who's not familiar with it, is the remote desktop protocol. It's the thing that allows us to remotely establish a session with a server. So Microsoft best practices states so that you should only make it so that authorized users and or devices can RDP into a domain controller. So in other words, you don't want to just turn on RDP and make it so that anytime anybody needs to manage it, they can just fire up an RDP session and connect to your domain controller. That's super risky. You want to be very selective about who you would allow. So put into place policies so that only specific users are able to establish an RDP session. And you may even want to go so far as to put firewall rules into place stating that only that carefully controlled, highly managed desktop that you use for your Active Directory management is able to RDP into your domain controller. Because otherwise you could run into a situation where an administrator just gets lazy. I mean, let's face it, we all do it. And they need to change something on a domain controller, but that management station's on the other side of the building, and, well, I'll just do it from here. It's just as easy. It doesn't matter this one time. Having those rules in place, that'll keep situations like that from happening, and it'll keep your environment ultimately more secure. Okay, avenues to compromise. And again, this came directly off the Microsoft website. And I found this interesting. It says, regardless of the motivation of the attacker, most information security breaches start with the compromise of one or two systems at a time. These initial events or entry points into the network often leverage vulnerabilities that could have been fixed but were not. So the Active Directory environment normally starts out as, or I'm getting ahead of myself. So basically what this is saying is that a lot of times what an attacker will do if they want to take over your Active Directory environment is that they won't start out by attacking the Active Directory because, let's face it, we all have security around our Active Directory environment, and if an attacker just goes for it, they're going to do something to alert you to their presence. Hopefully we've all got systems in place that would let us know, hey, something's going on here that you need to know about. So an attacker doesn't generally do things that way. Instead, what they're going to do is look for other systems that are maybe unpatched and that have a known vulnerability, and then use that system as an entry point, and then launch an attack from there rather than going straight after the Active Directory environment. Another thing that's often done is to use ransomware or other types of malware. So what an attacker might do is target an end user in a particular environment. Send them an email with a malicious link, the user clicks on that link, and then that allows the attacker entry into that workstation. Well, what the attacker does is they harvest the user's credentials, and then they look at the SAM accounts database on that workstation. And you have to remember, the attacker doesn't necessarily have to know what passwords exist. The hashes that are stored in that SAM accounts database are just as good as a password. So they can use those hashes in an attack that's called pass the hash as a way of gaining access to other systems. So the attacker will move laterally using those stolen credentials and move from one system to another, looking for a system that an administrator has logged onto at some point in time. And then if they find that system, then they're able to take that hash and use that to compromise other systems, such as your Active Directory environment. So the best practice there would be to avoid ever logging onto a workstation with a privileged account. So another thing that came up on Microsoft's list of best practices is gaps in antivirus and anti-malware deployments. So we have a quote directly off Microsoft's website. In server populations, it's not uncommon to find that antivirus and anti-malware installations are consistently configured, outdated, misconfigured, or even disabled. In some cases, the antivirus and anti-malware software is disabled by administrative staff, but in other cases, attackers disable the software after compromising a server via other vulnerabilities. When the antivirus and anti-malware software is disabled, the attackers then plant malware on the server and focus on propagating compromises across the server population. So this all goes back to what I was talking about earlier, in that an attacker is able to plant malware on systems and then move laterally throughout the environment. But what this slide is really saying is that if you've got malware protection on your domain controller, which you should, it's really important to keep that up to date. Think back to those laws of computer security that I talked about at the very beginning. I can't remember which number it was, but one of those laws said that outdated anti-malware software is only marginally better than no malware protection at all. So it's really important to make sure that you've got that malware protection on your domain controllers and that it's being kept up to date. Now, I know that sounds silly. We all know the dangers of malware and ransomware and things like that, and everybody uses malware protection, and rightly so. I get it. But one of the things that often occurs in production environments is that there is all this diligence that's put into place with making sure that end users are secure and the workstations have up-to-date malware protection. But a lot of times servers end up getting neglected. I'm not really sure why that is, but it's one of those things that I've seen over and over again. So make sure that anti-malware software is installed on your servers and that it's kept up to date and that it's remaining active, that it hasn't been disabled. And yes, I've actually seen situations where an administrator has disabled anti-malware software as a matter of convenience. Because I can't think of an example off of the top of my head, but we've probably all seen situations where you get ready to make a major configuration change in Windows, and the Microsoft documentation that goes along with it says disable your anti-malware software. So you go in and do that so that you can make the configuration change, and then you forget to turn it back on. So that's one of those things to look out for. So another issue that kind of goes along with sporadic anti-malware software is incomplete patching. So the quote from the Microsoft website is, "It is common to find that the organization's patch management strategy contains gaps. Windows systems in these environments are inconsistently patched. Non-Windows operating systems are patched sporadically, if at all. Commercial off-the-shelf applications contain vulnerabilities for which patches exist but have not been applied. Networking devices are often configured with factory default credentials and no firmware update years after their installation. Applications and operating systems that are no longer supported by their vendors are often kept running despite the fact that they can no longer be patched against vulnerabilities. Each of these unpatched systems represents another potential entry point for attackers." Okay, so what this is really getting down to is that when it comes to the servers on your network, it isn't just the operating system itself that has to be patched. Yes, you have to make sure that it's patched and that patches are applied in a timely manner. That's super important. But your applications can also pose a huge problem. Because let's suppose that you've got a really outdated application that uses a legacy authentication method. Well, if that application depends on that legacy authentication method, that's not something that you're going to be able to disable in your environment, and it weakens your overall security. Even if there's nothing specifically wrong with that application, just the simple fact that it depends on that legacy authentication can weaken your organization's overall security. The other point that this particular slide was trying to make is that you've got to make sure to look for available patches and things other than applications. Make sure that the hardware devices that you're using aren't using default passwords and that you're consistently applying firmware updates to those devices as they become available. Because just as software is sometimes subject to security vulnerabilities that can be remedied through patches, the same holds true for hardware as well. For example, the storage array that I personally use, I just applied a firmware update yesterday that addressed a critical security vulnerability. So incomplete patching continued. Another thing that Microsoft goes on to say is that the consumerization of IT has introduced additional challenges in that employee-owned devices are being used to access corporate-owned data, and the organization may have little to no control over the patching and configuration of employees' personal devices. This is another huge part about why it's so important to keep your domain controllers isolated, because unfortunately our environments aren't quite as sterile as they once were. We have end users working remotely from personal devices. If you really stop and think about it, the whole concept that IT adhered to for years and years of defending the perimeter no longer applies. The perimeter is gone. Because at one time, the general rule of thumb was that if you can keep the bad guys from coming into your four walls and you can keep your employees who are inside those four walls from sending anything outside that they shouldn't, then it was all good. But today, that's no longer the case. Those four walls don't exist. It was sped up by COVID, but it was really starting to happen long before COVID, because already we were moving applications out of the data center and up into the cloud. We had users who were working remotely, often from personal devices. So the whole idea of defending the perimeter just doesn't really hold up anymore. Instead, the main thing that you should be focusing on today rather than the perimeter is identities. And I'm not just talking about user accounts. I'm talking about identities related to devices, IoT devices that you might be using, even bots that you might be using in your environment. One of the big IT concepts that we've been trying to get to over the last few years is that of zero trust. And a big part of zero trust is being able to trust that the identities that are being presented truly are who they claim to be, whether we're talking about a user or a machine or something else. Another thing that Microsoft had out on their site, and I love this one, is just a really short quote. You can't expect a 6-year-old operating system let me try that again. You can't expect a 6-year-old operating system to protect you against a 6-month-old attack. So there's probably a little bit of hyperbole in there, but the point that this is trying to make is that it's super critical to keep your systems patched and up to date, because attacks come about all the time. And the attacks that come out today aren't necessarily like the ones that came about yesterday. So if you've got an old system that's out of date and unpatched, it's going to be vulnerable to all of these newer attacks, because new vulnerabilities are discovered all the time. So Microsoft goes on to say that outdated systems can even require weakening of certain AD or Active Directory and directory service security configurations. Applications that were written to use legacy authentication protocols by vendors who are no longer supporting the applications usually cannot be retooled to support stronger authentication mechanisms. This goes back to what I was talking about earlier, about if you've got a really old, outdated application that you're using, but it requires a legacy authentication protocol, then your entire Active Directory environment might be weakened simply because you have to leave support for legacy authentication turned on. And then Microsoft goes on to say, to eliminate legacy systems and applications, you should first focus on identifying and categorizing them, then on determining whether to upgrade or replace the application or host. Although it can be difficult to find replacements for highly specialized applications for which there is neither support nor an upgrade path, you may be able to leverage a concept called creative destruction to replace the legacy application with a new application that provides the necessary functionality. So what all of this is really saying is that the first thing that you need to do is take an inventory of the applications that are being used throughout your organization. Hopefully, you've already got an inventory like that, but if you don't, it's super important to go ahead and take the initiative to make a current inventory of all the applications that are being used. At that point, the next step is to assess the health of each one of those applications. Is the vendor who supplied that application still in business? Is the application something that your organization is even still using? Maybe it's still installed somewhere, but nobody's actually using it. They moved to something else years ago, and this just got left turned on for whatever reason. Or is the application something that's being regularly updated? So whatever the case, you need to find out what your options are. If the application is something where the vendor is still in business and they're continuing to provide updates, great. Just make sure that you are providing those updates as they become available. because those updates are going to be critical to the overall security of your environment. If, on the other hand, you've got applications that the vendor is no longer updating, then you've got a couple of options at that point. One option is to keep using the application, which is risky for a number of different reasons. Another option is to look for a competing application that does what you need it to do, even if it's not a perfect match for the application that you are using. That can be a painful transition, obviously, but in the long run, that may be a better approach from a security standpoint. So misconfigurations. In environments where systems are generally kept current and patched, we commonly identify gaps or misconfigurations in the operating system, applications running on computers, and Active Directory. Some misconfigurations expose only the local computer to compromise, but after a computer is owned, attackers usually focus on further propagating the compromise across other systems and eventually to Active Directory. Following are some of the common areas in which we identify configuration that introduce risk. So this goes back to what I was talking about earlier, where an attacker will establish a foothold on some potentially meaningless system, such as an endpoint that a user works from, or a relatively non-important server, or something like that, and then use that system as a jumping-off point to attack the rest of the organization, whether they're using a pass-the-hash attack or something else. So the idea here is that when it comes to Active Directory security, you can't focus solely on the Active Directory. You've also got to make sure that any systems that are connected to that Active Directory environment are configured according to Microsoft security best practices. Then we get into Microsoft saying that one especially common misconfiguration is the presence of a browser on a domain controller. And this goes back to the whole thing that I was talking about earlier about it's best to run domain controllers in server core configuration so that there's no GUI and there's no temptation to even try to open a browser on the domain controller. Microsoft also goes on to say that as a best practice, you should actively block web access to domain controllers through things like firewall rules, through app blocker rules, and stuff like that. Now, this is one of those things that you really have to kind of think through before you do it, because initially it would seem to fly in the face of some of Microsoft's other recommendations. I mean, think about what Microsoft said about patch management. Stop using your centralized WSUS server and handle patch management specifically for the domain controller. So if you're cutting off internet access, then that could be a problem. What you would have to do in this situation like that is come up with a secure way of making sure that your WSUS server is able to get the updates that it needs, preferably from the internet, rather than from your other WSUS server, or you're undermining the whole thing, without allowing your domain controllers direct access to the internet. Now, in that case, that's relatively easy to do. But when it comes to keeping your anti-malware software up to date, you might have to come up with a completely different approach depending on what it is that you're using. Because if your domain controllers don't have any kind of internet access, then you're kind of at the mercy of the anti-malware vendor to provide you with an alternate means of getting updates. So privileged groups. According to Microsoft, the accounts in Active Directory that are most commonly targeted by attackers are those that are members of the most highly privileged groups, such as members of the Domain Admins Group, Enterprise Admins Group, or a built-in Administrators Group in Active Directory. The membership of these groups should be reduced to the smallest number of accounts possible so that the attack surface of these groups is limited. So this one's really just common sense. Don't make anybody an administrator that you don't have to. Don't add anybody to a privileged group unless there's a very compelling reason to do so. You know, it's kind of funny. I did another webcast yesterday on a different subject, and one of the guys that was on that webcast mentioned something about that they had done a job for a school, and they went in to check out this environment, and every single student was a domain admin. And the tech who had set that environment up actually believed that the students wouldn't be able to log in unless they had domain admin privileges. So you just never know what you're going to run into in the real world. When it comes to privileged accounts, Microsoft says that privileged accounts should only be used when absolutely necessary. So in other words, you don't want to run into a situation where you're sitting at your desk and you've got a privileged account that you're using for your day-to-day stuff, but also for managing servers. It's better to have two separate accounts, one that you're using for checking your email and browsing the web and doing team sessions or whatever else you do throughout the day, and an entirely separate account that you use for Active Directory management. Additionally, I would recommend, and this one didn't come from Microsoft, this came from me, but I would recommend avoiding using the built-in admin account if at all possible, and instead anybody who's on the IT staff who needs administrative privileges should be given their own dedicated administrative account. Now, some people would say that that's a bad thing because you're creating additional privileged accounts that you have to worry about, and I totally get that. The flip side of that, however, is that if you've got separate privileged accounts for each person who needs privileged access, then that makes auditing a lot easier. Remember what I said earlier about that rogue employee who was going out and actively sabotaging the systems? Imagine what would happen if everybody shared one administrative account, the built-in domain admin's account, as opposed to having their own account. It would have been impossible to look at the logs and figure out who it was that was doing those sorts of things because everybody would be using the same account. So having separate accounts for each administrator just makes logging a little bit easier, and it just kind of helps to keep everybody honest. So then Microsoft goes on and says that when we assess domain controllers, we often find them configured and managed no differently than member servers. Domain controllers sometimes run the same applications and utilities installed on member servers, not because they're needed on the domain controllers, but because the applications are part of a standard build. And then they go on to say that in some breaches, attackers have used the tools that were already installed on domain controllers, not only to gain access to the domain controllers, but to modify or damage the Active Directory database. So the idea there is that if you're using a gold image to deploy your domain controllers, then just make sure you're using a separate one from your member servers. Don't install a piece of software just because, well, that's what we put on all of the servers. Think carefully about what should go on your domain controllers. In my mind, the only things that you should be running on domain controllers, aside from what comes with it, is anti-malware software, perhaps a backup agent if you have a specific need to back up that given domain controller, and if there's any kind of management agent that you have to install. Aside from that, keep software off of your domain controllers to the greatest extent possible, because anything that gets installed on there increases the attack surface of that domain controller. So web browsing and downloading. According to Microsoft, in some cases the accounts have configured Internet Explorer settings on the domain controllers to allow download of Internet content, and freeware utilities have been downloaded from Internet sites and installed on domain controllers. Internet Explorer Enhanced Security configuration is enabled for users and administrators by default, yet we often observe that it has been disabled for administrators. So this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. It's best to just run in a server core configuration, and then you don't have to worry about any of this. But one thing that I would add to that is Microsoft's recommendation earlier that domain controllers don't have any sort of Internet access. That's not just to keep the bad guys from coming in, but it's also to prevent anybody from downloading anything that they're not supposed to. Because remember, you don't have to have a browser to be able to download something. In PowerShell, there is a command that you can actually use to go out and initiate a download. I did a webcast for Redmond a few weeks ago, and I believe I showed how to do that. So just one more reason why your domain controller shouldn't have Internet access. But then Microsoft goes on and says, with a highly privileged account access to, or let me say that again, when highly privileged accounts access the Internet and download content to any computer, that computer is put at severe risk. When the computer is a domain controller, the entire Active Directory domain installation is put at risk. So that really says it all. You really don't want to have somebody operating a highly privileged account on a domain controller accessing the Internet. Then Microsoft goes on and says that domain controllers should be treated as critical infrastructure components and secured more stringently and configured more rigidly than file print and application servers. They say domain controllers should not run any software that's not required for the domain controller to function or doesn't protect the domain controller against attack. And domain controllers should not be permitted to access the Internet, and security settings should be configured and enforced by group policy objects. So we're really not saying anything new here. other than just the domain controllers need to be hardened, and they needed to be treated differently than your basic member servers. So one other thing to consider about domain controller deployment is that a lot of organizations will use baseline deployments for domain controllers. So in other words, they've got an image that's already set up ahead of time, and that image is used to deploy all of the new domain controllers. And that's great because it allows the domain controllers to be deployed in a really consistent way, and it helps to remove human error from the equation. So I'm a big believer in deploying domain controllers in a really unified way like this. But there are a couple of things to remember. One, if you're using these baseline configurations, don't just manually deploy a domain controller because it's a quick and dirty way of getting something done and you need to get it done quick. Because when you do that, you're going to introduce inconsistencies. The other thing to keep in mind is that if you are going to use a baseline configuration for domain controller deployment, it's extremely important to thoroughly scrutinize that baseline configuration and make sure that it really is what it needs to be. Because any security deficiency that happens to make it into that baseline deployment is going to get replicated to every domain controller that's created based on that deployment. And one more thing that I will add to that that's not on the slide is that, one more thing that I would add to that that's not on the slide is your baseline configuration should be updated regularly, particularly if you're deploying domain controllers from an image, because you want to make sure that the image that you're using always has the latest security updates on it. I once heard of a story, and I have no way of knowing if this is credible or not, but an organization that you have all heard of, it was a major company, I don't want to say the name, ended up deploying a new domain controller, and they did it from the Windows Server installation media. So there were no security patches on it initially. It was just the RTM release that was provided by Microsoft. And so they did the deployment, and it took them probably an hour or two to get everything done. Before they even had a chance to apply the first security patch, it had already been compromised. So again, I've got no way of verifying that story, but it underscores the importance of periodically updating those gold images to make sure that they have security patches on it. So you're making sure that when you deploy a new domain controller, that domain controller is already patched to the greatest extent possible. And then the last thing that I want to talk about is network endpoints. One of the critical things is to make sure that users don't have any local admin permissions on endpoint devices, because it allows software to be installed and run. Now, this is obviously one of those things that you don't want to do, but I wanted to go ahead and mention it anyway, because if we're talking about Active Directory security and attackers using a workstation or a low-grade member server as a way of establishing a foothold, denying them the ability to run software on that device under the user's credentials is one more way that you can protect your Active Directory environment. And then finally, never ever log into a Windows PC with a privileged account because of the risk of pass-the-hash attacks. So with that said, I am about out of time. I want to go ahead and open it up for questions and answers.
Great. Let's go ahead with questions. And first of all, Brian, thanks for that really great presentation. A lot of good advice for our audience members to take away from today. Questions. We have a lot of good ones. First of all, a clarification request from Carrie. Can you repeat your recommendation again regarding accounts that you should not sync from local AD to Azure via Azure AD Connect?
Yeah, I think Microsoft may have even made this the default. At some point, you'll want to go ahead and double-check me on that. But if you have any accounts that are privileged accounts that are solely used in the on-premises Active Directory environment, then there's really no benefit to having those types of accounts replicated up to the Azure AD Cloud because they don't do anything up there. But they could create additional security risks, so it's best to not replicate those specific accounts.
Got it. And another one here, how would Zero Trust infrastructure look like in Azure AD/Azure AD Domain Services environment?
That's one of those questions that it's going to be different for everybody. The Zero Trust isn't one of those things where you can just go out and buy a particular product and now we have Zero Trust. It doesn't work like that. It's more of a way of doing things, and it's going to be different in every organization. But if your goal is to establish Zero Trust in an Azure AD environment, one of the very first things that I would recommend checking out is conditional access policies. Think of them as if-then statements for access to resources. I guess that's the simplest way that I could explain it. An analogy that I often use is it's one thing if you've got a user who comes in and sits down at their desk every morning at 9 a.m. and accesses a particular resource. It's another thing if that same user logs in from a rogue nation on the other side of the planet at 3 o'clock in the morning and attempts to access that resource. It's two totally different things. In one case, it's perfectly safe to give the user access. The other case, it definitely would not be in your best interest to allow access. And those are the types of things that conditional access policies can help you with. They're a really great step forward with establishing zero trust because they allow you to take a look at a lot of things that would normally be taken for granted.
Right. Here's one from Justin. He says, the problem I have with running a DC in server core is that all the other software, including backup software, anti-malware, etc., requires the GUI environment. How do you use tools like this when in server core?
Yeah, that's a really tricky one because you're right. Sometimes if the product that you're using absolutely requires a GUI, there's just no getting around it. However, there are agentless backup products that can back up a server remotely. Another thing that you can do is look for one that requires an agent that doesn't require a GUI. Or something else that you can do is, I don't know what size your organization is or anything, but let's say you've got a dozen domain controllers. Maybe you only need to run backup against one of those, and you would be able to configure the other 11 as server core and just have the GUI on that one domain controller as opposed to it being on all of them.
Great. And then I think we have time for one more. This one's from Brian. The idea of not logging into endpoints, a privileged account, is great, but if a device is secure, the support staff needs access to fix. Do you recommend a dedicated desktop?
Can you say that again? You cut out for a second.
Oh, sure. Sorry about that. He says the idea of not logging into endpoints, the privileged account, is great, but if a device is secure, the support staff needs access to fix it. Do you recommend, in this case, a dedicated desktop admin account?
Yeah, that's certainly one way of going with it. Maybe you could create a local account on those devices as opposed to using a domain account, separate name, different passwords, so that way you're not putting anything in the security accounts manager on that machine that an attacker would be able to use to gain access to your Active Directory domain.